Hello. Our next speaker is David Rubin, and his talk is titled An Unnamed Blank That Craved a Name, A Genealogy of Intersex as Gender. David Rubin is a senior lecturer in the Women's and Gender Studies program at Vanderbilt University, where he's taught since receiving his PhD in Women's Studies from Emory University in 2010. His research and teaching interests include critical intersex studies, feminist and queer theory, the history of science, LGBT studies, transnational feminisms, masculinity studies, and disability studies. He's the author of a paper by the same name as the paper he's delivering today, that's in Signs, and also of Compromising Complicities on the Sex, Race and Globalization Project, and a companion to lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer studies, and author of Women's Studies, Neoliberalism, and the Paradox of the Political in Women's Studies for the Future. He's currently working on a book project that investigates the convergences and divergences between biomedicine, intersex activism, and feminist, queer, and disability studies. Join me in welcoming David.
Thank you so much. Wow, this is really high. I don't think I've ever been this high before. Feels kind of weird. So I didn't mean that as it sounded. To begin, just some thank yous. Huge thank you to Professor Angie Willey. We go back to grad school together, and I'm tremendously grateful to her. And to the 5 colleges, Feminist Science Technology Initiative, as well as the various women's, gender, and sexuality studies programs at the 5 colleges who made this event today. As I was saying to both Angie and Linnell and Caitlin earlier, it's really rare and special to be in a place where you can talk with other people about intersex issues, sort of period. So I think this is a really special space to be in today, and I'm really, really honored and grateful to be here, especially to be presenting alongside such seasoned and brilliant thinkers and activists like Linnell and Caitlin. I don't know that I can meet the high bar they've set thus far, but I'll try to do my best. What I can bring to this discussion, I think today, my goal is to bring a little bit of historical contextualization, specifically, as my title indicates, a genealogy. Let me say a word or two about that word, and also about the overall goal of what I'm going to try to do today before I actually dive into the paper itself. You can put it on if you want. Thank you. So when Angie originally asked me to come and present this work, I didn't yet know when the piece that just came out in Signs was going to be out. So I should begin by apologizing to those who have read that piece. I understand some folks have, and I'm really honored by that. It's such a crazy feeling, kind of amazing. And I look forward to hearing your comments and suggestions and thoughts later on that. So I didn't know. It wasn't actually supposed to be out until this fall, so I was hoping this would sort of be my last chance to present this material before it came out. It came out early. And I decided it was important enough, especially because I'm still working on and revising the argument for my current book project, which is called Intersex and the Invention of Gender. What is the subtitle? It has a cool one, I promise. I can't remember. No, it's Intersex and the Invention of Gender, Biomedicine, Embodiment, and Activism, something like that. Or it might be Embodiment at the Nexus of Biomedicine and Activism. I'm still revising it for this book project, and it's actually starting to change, even though it just came out in publication form. Some of us keep working. We can't. Sometimes a piece, how do I say? I don't feel fully autonomous over my own pieces. I feel like I help to bring them into the world, if that makes sense. And sometimes they have a life that needs to continue even after they've been published, and they have to keep changing, and you have to listen real carefully to them. So I'm still doing that. So what I'll be presenting today is a revised and abridged version of this piece that came out in Signs. So I apologize to those who've read it for the repetition, but I hope you'll still engage with me, especially where the ideas are changing. Finally, what is the goal of this project, and why do I think it's important to turn to genealogy to understand some of the larger history around debates about intersex, its medicalization, issues of ethics, and also the place of intersex in the field of women's gender and sexuality studies and the history of feminism. Unlike a standard approach to history that is linear, usually purely causal, and identifies a single origin and just a chain of events that follow successively, a genealogical approach to history looks for multiple origins and especially contestations of linear logic and strict causality. And so what I'm presenting today tries to complexify our historical understanding of intersex as a category that was central to the medicalization of a diverse group of folks with variously understood anatomical configurations and its relationship to the categories of sex, gender, and especially power. So that's the goal today. Final word before I begin. And we're going to talk about this during the panel on teaching intersex in the context of women's gender and sexuality studies and other places as well. If in WGSS, women's gender and sexuality studies, the standard approach thus far to teaching intersex has been to use it to teach the social construction of sex and gender, that argument can be, or that approach can be viewed as problematic for a number of reasons. As I'll talk about later today, first, it seems to use an additive model, and we all know, or I'm guessing most of us know, the problems with additive models of oppression when it comes to studying other categories of identity. So it's not clear that an additive model is best for intersex. Likewise, it seems to use an exceptional model, as if the bodies and lives of people with intersex are exceptionally useful for teaching the social construction of sex and gender, but I'm not sure that's at all the case. And that model, especially the exceptional model, creates certain ethical quandaries, and it also starts to look like it's replicating the objectifying gaze that biomedicine has used all along in its attempt to pathologize and normalize intersexuality. So if that's the standard approach in WGS, part of what I'm going to argue when we have that second panel is that that needs to change, and that the study of intersex should be integrated throughout the WGSS curriculum in ways to highlight how all bodies, though in different ways, because they're each positioned by various categories and in different hierarchies and systems of power and privilege, how all bodies are mediated by biology, technology, culture, and power. So the argument today in this portion of the presentation is not going to be that intersex demonstrates the social construction of sex and gender, but rather I want to try to sort of flip that on its head and show how the history of the medicalization of intersex in fact gave birth to the categories by which everyone, at least in the West today, but even beyond the West, and I'll say something about that, understands themselves as a sexed and gendered subject, which is to say, if this is right, that intersex is important for everybody to learn about because its history, its deeply problematic medical history in particular, which needs to change, and the current medical model, I'll argue, needs to change, has in fact shaped not only the lives of people with intersex, but also in certain ways, a lot of other folks' lives too. Okay, now to begin. Let's see here. Whoops, oh, that's my cat presentation. No, just kidding. A lot of what I'm presenting is really dry historical material on the history of science. I didn't have space to fit in many good jokes, so this is the one I could fit in at the beginning. Wouldn't it be awesome if I had a cat presentation? I don't mean to marginalize any people who do feline studies. Okay, here we go. This is called An Unnamed Blank That Craved a Name. That's a quote that comes from a paper by John Money, and I'll talk a lot about him today. A genealogy of intersex as gender. What is the relation between intersex and dominant, residual, and emergent configurations, of sex and gender? What is the relation, how might thinking critically about the norms, processes, and structures that regulate embodiment enable a critical rethinking of intersex and vice versa? How do contestations over intersex converge and diverge with debates about the politics of difference and struggles for sexual and gender justice in a multicultural transnational world? In what follows, I engage these questions by tracing a genealogy of intersexuality's under-recognized but historically pivotal role in the development of gender as a concept in 20th century American biomedicine, feminism, and their globalizing circuits. Using a queer feminist science studies approach, I argue that intersex has been and remains central to the history of gender as a classificatory schema, object of knowledge, technology of subject formation, and paradigm of sociality in late modernity. This genealogy attempts to push beyond current scholarship on intersexuality, and I'll review a bit of that, by suggesting that while dominant understandings of sex and gender have overdetermined the meaning of intersex as we understand that term today, historically speaking, as it turns out, and paradoxically, the concept of intersex, in fact, preceded and inaugurated what we would today call in WGSS the sex-gender distinction. Through a close reading of psychoendocrinologist John Money's biomedical research, I showed that intersex was integral to the historical emergence of the category gender as distinct from sex in the mid-20th century English-speaking world. I critique the heteronormative masculinism of Money's approach to intersex and his pathologization of people with variant anatomies, but I also examine his lasting yet under-interrogated legacy in feminist scholarship from the second wave through the present. In the first part of this talk, I'll try to contextualize the terms of my argument, link it to the field of critical intersex studies as it exists today. In the second part, I'll review relevant feminist rethinkings of sex and gender in order to set the stage for the third part, where I'll read Money's mid-20th century research as a genealogical point of rupture, wherein gender attained a meaning distinct from sex. Finally, I'll conclude by reflecting on what the intertwined histories of intersex, biomedicine, and feminism might mean for the field of women's and gender and sexuality studies. Okay. So here's part one, Gender and Intersex Studies, Feminist Theory in Biomedicine. Oops. In 1990, as many of you undoubtedly know, Suzanne J. Kessler published The Medical Construction of Gender, Case Management of Intersexed Infants in Science, Journal of Women and Culture and Society. Ranked among the top 20 most cited science articles of the past 2 decades, Kessler's essay focalized a practice that was, up until the early 1990s, rarely discussed outside of specialized medical circles: the surgical normalization of infants born with sexual anatomies that society deems to be non-standard. And by the way, that's my working definition of intersex, and we can talk more about that if you want later. The surgical normalization of infants born with sexual anatomies that society deems non-standard. Analyzing interviews with physicians and the medical literature on intersex treatment, Kessler argued that, quote, members of medical teams have standard practices for managing intersexuality that ultimately rely on cultural understandings of gender. Pointing to clinicians' reliance on Money's optimal gender paradigm, which presumes that surgical normalization will foster conventional gender identities and which I'll discuss in more detail later on, Kessler underlined the ethical problems of the medicalization of intersexual difference. Noting that the vast majority of intersex conditions pose little or no health risk, she concluded that intersexuality, quote, is corrected, and she put that term in quotes, not because it is threatening to the infant's life, but because it is threatening to the infant's culture. Following Kessler's lead, during the past 20 years, a small but growing number of scholars have made vital contributions to feminist and queer theory, science studies, bioethics, medical sociology, and debates about human rights and bodily integrity by showing that intersexuality challenges naturalized understandings of embodiment through analyses of the medical construction of sexual dimorphism. As my language indicates, I am interested in the implications of an unremarked discursive shift that began to manifest itself as this body of interdisciplinary research developed. In Kessler's wake, the analytic preoccupation of intersex studies was displaced almost immediately from gender to sex, as evidenced by the titles of works published following the medical construction of gender, such as Sexing the Body by Fausto Sterling in her earlier articles, The Five Sexes, and then The Five Sexes Revisited. Also, Sexing the Intersexed by Sharon Preves, and then most recently, Fixing Sex by Katrina Karkazis. One can interpret this shift as a transition from the social back to the somatic, reading the emphasis on sexing as consonant with and influenced by the recognition of the limitations of the essentialism-constructionism divide and the consequent push to rethink the materiality of the body in 1990s feminist theory post-gender trouble. But this alone does not explain why gender receded into the theoretical background of intersex studies as the field began to congeal. While Fausto Sterling, Prevs, Carcasis, and others have undoubtedly sharpened critical perspectives on the medicalization of people with intersex, their accounts have largely focused on rethinking the sex side of the sex-gender distinction. For this reason, less attention has been paid to questions about the relation between intersex and gender, questions that were implicitly posed but not fully answered in Kessler's initial Signs essay, such as, what is the historical relationship between intersex and the sex-gender distinction? How has the sex-gender distinction shaped and been shaped by intersex? The elision of these questions has been reinforced by an influential strain of intersex activism. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, the now defunct Intersex Society of North America, ISNA, avowed that, quote, intersexuality is primarily a problem of stigma and trauma, not gender. As Ian Moreland argues, this claim crucially acknowledged that affected individuals, rather than their parents or doctors, are experts on their own genders, and further suggested that, quote, traditional treatment often inadvertently creates trauma and thus fails by its own standards, end quote. In this way, ISNA challenged the medical model of intersex management and that model's surgical equation of dimorphic genitalia with normative sex, promoting instead a patient-centered approach founded, as I'm sure many of you know, on the principle of ending unnecessary infant genital surgeries and hormone treatments. Although this claim buttressed ISNA's opposition to non-consensual genital surgery, it also obscured, and due to ISNA's lasting impact, continues to obscure the powerful role of gender as both a concept and a practice in the development of modern intersex medicine and the sciences of sexual health more broadly. Before it became a key term in feminist discourse, before it came to signify the social construction of femininity and masculinity, gender was formulated in mid-20th century American sexology as a diagnostic solution to the so-called medical emergency of intersex bodies, or bodies in doubt, to borrow historian Elizabeth Rees's apt and recent characterization. The story of intersex is therefore not only, as ISNA asserted, and rightly asserted, a story about shame, secrecy, and unwanted genital surgeries, a story about, quote, stigma and trauma, but also a story about the regulation of embodied difference through biopolitical discourses, practices, and technologies of normalization that materialize in, through, and as gender. As Jennifer Gurman argues, gender does in fact have a history, and a controversial one at that. In Gender, a Genealogy of an Idea, Gurman draws on Bernice Hausman to argue that it was not until the mid-20th century that English speakers began using gender as an ontological category, a category said to denote masculine and feminine states of subjective being. In particular, Gurman suggests that money's influence upon the career of the gender concept has been even more decisive than Kessler initially indicated in that Signs article I referred to earlier. According to Gurman, it was through the research Money undertook as a graduate student at Harvard University in the 1950s on what was then called hermaphroditism, and he used that term interchangeably with intersex. I recognize many folks do consider the former offensive. I will use it as little as possible in this presentation, but I'll use it in certain necessary instances when Money is referring specifically to what he was calling hermaphroditism. Furthermore, Gurman argues that not only was gender central to Money's project of research as a doctoral student, but also it became central to his treatment paradigm that he founded while treating intersex patients at Johns Hopkins University, and we should certainly put treatment in quotations there. Through these various practices, Gurman suggests, gender came to be recognized across the sciences, social sciences, and humanities as an explanatory measure of human behavior in these various fields. And she says this is really important in the history of the concept. My analysis that I'll offer below converges with Gurman's in exploring the enduring significance of Money's research and the centrality of people with intersex to the history and politics of gender. In an effort to deepen and extend Gurman's argument, I argue not only that intersexuality played a crucial role in the invention of gender as a category in mid-20th century biomedical and subsequently feminist discourses, and that Money used the concept of gender to cover over and displace the biological instability of the body he discovered through his research on intersex. I also contend that money's conception of gender produced new technologies of psychosomatic normalization. In contrast with Gurman, my aim is not to, quote, critically reinvigorate money's gender concept, but rather to more fully excavate the broad swath of its regulatory power and, in a certain sense, to begin a project of attempting to provincialize gender. I'll say more about that in a little bit. Here, I'll just briefly state, I think that in WGSS and in a lot of other fields, as well as beyond the university, people tend to use and think of the category of gender as, even if it's something that's historically and culturally variable, as something that everybody nonetheless always already has and has to have. And I think that is a tremendously universalizing argument that's far overstating the case and really missing crucial historical details. So in an effort to provincialize the concept of gender, what I want to present is, in a certain sense, the idea that it hasn't always been as it is today, and indeed the concept hasn't always played a governing role in various societies in the same way it does, say, in the modern West today, and that things could be very different. So I want to try to reveal the contingency of this concept, if I can put it that way. Oh, I was supposed to click to the next slide there. I'll let you all look at that before I go to the next one. With the exception of Gurman and Hausman, the impact of money's research on the development of the modern conception of gender has not received sustained feminist attention. This part's called Rethinking Sex and Gender. This is striking. It's striking that there hasn't been sustained feminist attention to money's role in the development of the modern conception of gender, because intersex has been linked to gender in feminist discourse since at least the early 1970s. In her 1972 monograph, Sex, Gender, and Society, which unfortunately has been out of print for many, many years now, British sociologist Anne Oakley argued that gender, quote, is a matter of culture. It refers to the social classification into masculine and feminine. I'm guessing for most of the folks here, especially the WGSS folks, this should be a very familiar definition. Defining sex as biological and gender as cultural, Oakley drew her conception of the sex-gender distinction directly from the work of psychoanalyst Robert Stoller and then psychoendocrinologist John Money and his colleagues Joan and John Hampson in the endocrine clinic of the Johns Hopkins Hospital. She literally cites them and says this is where she's taken the concept from. Both Gurman and Meyerowitz observe further that Stoller himself adopted gender from Money's early work. Summarizing their research, that is, the research of Stoller and Money, Oakley writes, while Stoller talks about gender identity, Money and the Hampsons refer to psychosexual orientation. The meaning of both terms is the sense an individual has of him or herself as male or female, a belonging to one group or one or other group. The development of this sense is essentially the same for both biologically normal and abnormal individuals. Notice how quickly that rolls off her pen there. But the study of the biologically abnormal can tell us a great deal about the relative parts played by biology and social rearing. End quote. Oakley's uncritical acceptance of the normal-abnormal distinction as a biological given reiterates a foundational epistemological presumption underlying Stoller's and Money and the Hampsons' research, that humans may be naturally divided into clear and discernible normal and pathological types. In recent years, scholars in feminist, queer, critical race, post-colonial, disability, transgender, and intersex studies have shown this presumption to be culturally and politically motivated. That is, it's not a natural, just a naturally occurring distinction out there in the world, but rather is something that is created over time in order to police, say, the appropriate configurations of embodiment, or the configurations a particular society considers legitimate versus illegitimate, or intelligible versus unintelligible, or valuable versus unvaluable. Analyzing several case studies from Stoller's work, Oakley argues that parents' attitudes in rearing have a strong effect on children's gender presentations. This was, at the time in the 70s, a very popular argument that has now been questioned. We'll get to that in a moment. She turns to Money and the Hampsons, suggesting that, quote, case studies of individuals, though fascinating, cannot alone support sweeping generalizations about the lack of identity between sex and gender. A large group of hermaphroditic patients have been studied by Money and the Hampsons, and in 95% of all the cases, totaling 113, which is a large number for this sort of abnormality. Again, notice her pathologizing language. I really want to point that out and problematize it. But nonetheless, she says, the sex of rearing corresponded to gender identity. Most significantly, the correspondence held for even those individuals whose sex of rearing contradicted their biological sex as determined by chromosomes, hormones, gonads, and the formations of the internal and external genitals. End quote. In other words, Oakley used Money and the Hampsons' data on intersexual patients to forward what is now recognizable as a theory of gender's social construction. In other words, she used Money and the Hampsons' data much as I think folks in WGSS use Fausto Sterling, the Five Sexes article. So much as Fausto Sterling uses intersex to make this argument about social construction, I think Oakley was doing something very similar, but at a much earlier time. Working within a nature-culture paradigm that presumed the two terms to be strictly oppositional, Oakley put pressure on the culture side of the equation to stress that gender roles, notably those that perpetuate male domination and female subordination, were learned, not inborn. Quote, sex differences may be natural, and she put natural in quotation marks, but gender differences, she said, have their source in culture, not nature. Putting the natural in quotation marks, Oakley contended, as would many feminists who followed in her footsteps, that social structures perpetuate gender inequalities by naturalizing them as innate sex differences. While extremely valuable as a critique of the workings of patriarchal power, this argument was founded on at least two assumptions that later feminists and others would call into question. First, that sex is purely biological. But how do we know? And second, that sex and gender are naturally and normatively dimorphic. Again, how do we know? Where does that knowledge come from? Who is it useful for? Who does it police? We'll get to those questions. Thus, even as she challenged the claim that gender roles reflect innate differences between the sexes, Oakley simultaneously, and this is a striking move here, she simultaneously consolidated a binary understanding of gender as the basis of a feminist politics of women's liberation. But as some feminist theorists began arguing in the late 1980s and early 1990s, positing sex as the basis of gender fails to account for the socio-cultural constitution of biological sex itself. The feminist most cited for formulating this argument is Judith Butler, whose 1990 monograph, as I'm guessing many of you are aware, queried how the regulatory operations of what she called the heterosexual matrix maintain various sexual hierarchies. Butler intervened in feminist debates over the sex-gender distinction by questioning the idea that biological sex is the foundation of cultural gender, challenging the assumption that sex forms the natural substance onto which the social meaning of gender is written. Butler proposed that, quote, gender ought not to be conceived merely as the cultural inscription of meaning on a pre-given sex, a juridical conception. Gender must also designate the very apparatus of production whereby the sexes themselves are established. End quote. In this view, gender is not simply a system of meanings imposed onto bodies, but is rather, and notice her words here, an apparatus of production. It's material. And she says further and qualifies this elsewhere, it's a performative bodily repertoire, an institutionalized set of discourses and practices that collectively seeks to naturalize the illusion of a pre-discursive sex. If, quote, sex itself is a gendered category, as Butler contends, then sex must be understood as a product rather than the cause or ground of gender. Butler's work usefully contrasts with Oakley's because it contests the presumption of natural sexual dimorphism by using a post-structuralist framework to destabilize foundationalist accounts of nature. Since the publication of Gender Trouble, scholars of feminist, queer, and transgender studies have denaturalized the sex-gender distinction by attending to the ways in which sex and gender fail to neatly align with each other and with the nature-culture distinction within and across a variety of historical and contemporary contexts. In recent years, there has also been what some have called a return to biology in feminist theory. Anne Fausto Sterling, Elizabeth A. Wilson, Karen Barad, Debelina Roy, and many, many others, I'm happy to share some citations if you like, have asked what happens when feminist theory goes beyond a critique of the sciences and takes biological material and scientific practice seriously. Most pertinent to my analysis here is Fausto Sterling's work. In Sexing the Body from 2000, Fausto Sterling investigates how various scientific disciplines, endocrinology, genetics, neuroscience, and other fields produce knowledge about gender, sex, and sexuality. And she argues against the dualisms of nature, culture, sex, gender, male, female, and heterosexuality, homosexuality. Fausto Sterling suggests that accounts of embodiment cannot afford to discount biological processes, yet she simultaneously stresses that biological processes are not exterior to culture. They're rather shaped by it, even as they shape culture too. This is an interactionist developmental systems theory framework. It's a lot, in this way, her work actually has a lot of similarities with somebody, for those of you who work in science studies or in the actual sciences, somebody like Robert Sapolsky. She actually shares a tremendous amount with him. If you're curious about that, we can talk about that later. So she seeks to read biological data through feminist theory in order to question the science of sexual dimorphism. And she also implicitly foregrounds the regulatory character of gender as a system of power. Check out this quote. She says, "Our bodies are too complex to provide clear-cut answers about sexual difference. The more we look for a simple physical basis for sex, the more it becomes clear that sex is not a purely physical category. What bodily signals and functions we define as male or female come already entangled in our ideas about gender." Sarah S. Richardson has an amazing new article about the gendering of the X chromosome that has happened in the history of chromosomal research, and it's in a recent issue of Science. I highly recommend it. It's that kind of research that Fausto Sterling is talking about here. According to Richardson, as well as some others, there are not that many things about the X that would make it, for instance, quintessentially and essentially a female chromosome, but we tend to think of the X as female and the Y as male. She asks, how did this come about, and traces a history and really problematizes the role of ideology in the production of these scientific ideas. So back to Fausto Sterling. She suggests that sex cannot be definitively disentangled from gender. And she turns to the history of the medicalization of people with intersex, among others, to show that scientific research is influenced by culture and that both shape how bodies come to matter. Quote, "Intersexuals seen as deviations from the norm who need to be fixed," she puts that in quotes, "in order to preserve a two-gender system are also studied by medical professionals to prove how natural," she puts that in quotes too, "the system is to begin with," end quote. Fausto Sterling's analysis of the medical history of intersexuality demonstrates that science does not merely reflect, but actually contributes to the production of cultural norms through its own supposedly value-free practices. I'm going to skip a little bit there. So some of the literature I've been reviewing here illustrates a few of the diverse ways feminists have rethought sex and gender. In the next section of this presentation, I will suggest that this feminist work provides a good critical basis for understanding how mid-20th century medical specialists formulated what would become the dominant paradigm of intersex treatment. There he is. Look at that face. And I don't mean it in that he's cute. I don't think he's, well, you'll see what I think. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, this is John Money, and this is part 3, Gender in Money's Research. So lurking behind the feminist history or the feminist story I've been telling about theories and categories of analysis, different understandings of bodies and subjectivity and so on and so forth, lurks the figure, or we might say ghost, of John Money. As the inventor of the term gender role, he's the first to use this term, Money's work brings into focus the role of intersex as an origin of gender and of the sex-gender distinction. Indeed, as I will suggest, 35 years before Gender Trouble, Money posited gender as prior to sex. But I won't be suggesting, just to give away a few of my cards here, that we should therefore start thinking Money is radical and great. The punchline will be, if I can put it that way, that his postulation of gender as prior to sex was a regulatory move. I'll get to that in a moment. So though the Oxford English Dictionary attributes the formulation of gender as a concept that emphasizes the social and the culture directly to Anne Oakley, who I discussed earlier, the term gender actually began to crystallize as a category with a meaning distinct from biological sex in English at least 20 years earlier. Historians debate this, and it's not settled by any means. But Hausman and Gurman observe In their accounts, gender first emerged as an explicit object of inquiry in the behavioral and hard sciences in the mid-1950s, specifically in Money's psychobiological research. While studying the relation between the endocrine functions, that is basically how hormones work, and psychological states of various people, including people with intersex at Harvard in the 1950s, Money coined the term gender role as a diagnostic category and this is really important, a treatment protocol for patients whose anatomical configurations he regarded as unintelligible within the dominant frame of dimorphic sex. For people with intersex characteristics whose bodies Money read as improperly sexed, gender role became a way for Money to predict and, as we will see, to literally attempt to fashion the sex that he thought they were supposed to have all along. Money's typical scientific approach used the abnormal to find and define the normal. His work on intersex, indeed, helped to popularize the view, and this is so widely held today, that gender is just essential to the sexual health of persons in general. But we should ask some questions about that, I'm going to suggest in a moment. Money first made reference to his theory of gender in a 1955 article published in the Bulletin of the Johns Hopkins Hospital with a challenging name, Hermaphroditism, Gender and Precocity in Hyperadrenocorticism, Psychologic Findings. In that paper, Money would later write in a 1995 essay, quote, "The word gender made its first appearance in English as a human attribute, but it was not simply a synonym for sex." With specific reference, note his pathologizing language here. I only read it because I think it's necessary to understand the context. With specific reference to the genital birth defect of hermaphroditism, it signified the overall degree of masculinity and or femininity that is privately experienced and publicly manifested in infancy, childhood, and adulthood, and that usually, though not invariably, correlates with the anatomy of the organs of procreation, end quote. This sentence is taken from a retrospective essay Money wrote on his life's work titled, quote, "Lexical History and Constructionist Ideology of Gender," and it's the opening chapter of a 1995 book he wrote where he was defending his history of research and scientific findings against critiques from, on the one hand, feminists and on the other hand, radical social constructionists. Just as a very minor side point here, Money is often couched as some sort of purely radical social constructionist. Actually, if you look at his work does not lead to that conclusion, and I'm not alone in arguing this. He adopted various positions over his lifetime, many of them deeply problematic, but he didn't just have one position, and it wasn't all rearing, though he thought rearing was really, really important. But you'll see as he progresses over his career later in his work, he comes to a much more interactionist approach that sees both biology and rearing as contributing to the production of human beings. In any case, that's a side point we can talk about later. So, in this essay that I referred to earlier, Lexical History and Constructionist Ideology of Gender from '95, he explains that he first became acquainted with what he was calling hermaphroditism in the Harvard Psychological Clinic, where he wrote his dissertation in 1952 entitled Hermaphroditism: An Inquiry into the Nature of a Human Paradox. For his dissertation, Money conducted 10 case studies with interviews and collected 248 cases from a medical literature review to show that, quote, psychosexual orientation bears a very strong relationship to teaching and the lessons of experience and should be conceived as a psychological phenomenon. By psychosexual orientation, Money meant, quote, libidinal inclination, sexual outlook, and sexual behavior as masculine or feminine in both its general and in its specifically erotic aspects, end quote. Now, if that definition sounds confusing to anyone, don't worry, welcome to the club. It sounds confusing to me too. And indeed, this confusion was not lost on Money himself. In this '95 essay, Lexical History and Constructionist Ideology of Gender, Money quotes his dissertation at length to reveal how his studies of hermaphroditism revealed for him the following problem. For the name of a single conceptual entity, there are too many words in the expression, and now he's quoting the quote I just quoted, libidinal orientation, sexual outlook, and sexual behavior as masculine or feminine in both its general and specifically erotic aspects. The challenge to give a unitary name to the concept embodied in these many words became pressing after my caseload of hermaphrodites studied in person had, after 1951, expanded from 10 to 60 in Lawson Wilkins Pediatric Endocrine Clinic at the Johns Hopkins Hospital, at which time a concise report of the findings became essential, end quote. Studying individuals with anatomical configurations he regarded as anomalous, Money initially and inadvertently proliferated diagnostic categories. Here, his research generated, he says, too many words. It's interesting that he notes that. This excess of signification, I would suggest, highlights the degree to which intersexuality troubled the symbolic resources of Money's biomedical episteme. To overcome the discursive proliferation that his studies of intersexuality generated, Money went in search of what he calls a unitary name. In short, Money sought to establish an exhaustive, monolithic taxonomy to explain and contain the discursive excess generated by hermaphroditism. Money's project, in other words, was to produce a coherent medical science of the abnormal. It was a pathologizing project from the very start. Money's dissertation suggested that psychosexual orientation is shaped by biological, social, and psychological factors. And in forwarding this thesis, Money was staging an argument with previous psychologists and sexologists who held that psychosexual orientation was purely biological and innate. In the 1950s, a time when biological determinism, while contested, was still dominant in the hard sciences, Money's insistence that masculinity and femininity could not be reduced to biology alone remains somewhat remarkable. Summarizing his post-1951 findings, I made the mistake again, okay. Summarizing his post-1951 findings, Money explains in Lexical History and Constructionist Ideology of Gender that, quote, the first step was to abandon the unitary definition of sex as male or female and to formulate a list of 5 prenatally determined variables of sex that hermaphroditic data had shown could be independent of one another, namely chromosomal sex, gonadal sex, internal and external morphologic sex, and hormonal sex, prenatal and pubertal, to which was added a 6th postnatal determinant, the sex of assignment and rearing. The 7th place at the end of this list was an unnamed blank that craved a name. After several burnings of the midnight oil, I arrived at the term gender role, conceptualized jointly as private in imagery and ideation and public in manifestation and expression. I want to try to pay really close attention here with you to Money's language to see what it reveals. It would seem that, quote unquote, the hermaphroditic data led Money to the hypothesis that biological sex is itself radically unstable, composed of heterogeneous elements that do not add up to a unitary conceptual entity. Let me pause here. Just for those who may not be familiar with some of this research or with the latest research on the biology of sex, chromosomes alone don't make you a man or a woman. Neither, despite what the hardwiring paradigm says, does exposure to testosterone or estrogen in utero. Neither does a certain organ. Neither does your internal or external morphology, and neither does your gonads. These are all various components or variables of sex people have studied over time, but no single one equals sex or gives sex. And moreover, all of these elements can be independent of one another, as demonstrated by the existence of people with various anatomies, meaning there's no single, as yet identified, causal basis of sex. I should be qualifying that claim a little more. We can do that in discussion, actually. There are things like the SRY gene, which is important to discuss, but nonetheless. So Money was essentially coming to the conclusion that sex itself was composed of these unstable heterogeneous elements that don't add up to a single unitary conceptual entity. And reckoning with this instability produced for Money a problem of language and reference, a problem of naming, which he earmarks with his peculiar tautology, an unnamed blank. Aren't all blanks unnamed already? Why does he need both words there? This will become important. The unnamed blank that craved a name that Money refers to in this passage can be read, I think, as a displacement of the biological instability exposed by intersexuality. In other words, in recognizing a list of prenatally and postnatally, quote, determined variables of sex that hermaphroditic data had shown could be independent of one another, end quote. Money's research dismantled the unitary conception of sex and in so doing produced an unnamed blank at the site of the body. This unnamed blank threatened the very semblance, that is, the appearance and coherence of sex. And to contain that threat, I'd like to argue today, Money filled the blank with gender. Put differently, Money used gender role to name and thereby semantically fill or cover over the void left by sex's lack of conceptual and referential unity. As Gurman puts it, quote, at a pragmatic level, gender provided a solution to the uncertainty of any absolute somatic sex. Gender served to stabilize what advances in medical technology had rendered more and more unstable during the first half of the 20th century, end quote. How are we doing on time here? Okay. While gender role offered stability where technology's destabilization of sex was concerned, it also gave Money a linguistic means to contain the discursive proliferation, which earlier he called too many words, occasioned by his research on intersex. By giving what he called the unitary name gender role to the unnamed blank, Money introduced a seemingly coherent sign where previously he had found only unstable, discontinuous elements. By figuring gender role as the name craved by the unnamed blank, Money thus overrides and conceals intersexuality's undoing of the structure and stability of sexual dimorphism and makes the internal and external manifestation of masculinity and femininity the pinnacle of his classificatory schema. In defining gender role in terms of interior and exterior expression as masculine or feminine, Money was extrapolating from what feminist political theorists, like Carol Pateman, would later argue is a gendered political construction through and through, the public-private distinction that emerged in the Western world in 18th century social contract theory. Treating this uninterrogated public-private distinction as an abiding feature of gendered subjectivity, Money recognized that gender roles' unity was not a given. One could privately identify as feminine, yet publicly manifest a masculine identity, or vice versa. And this apparent contradiction suggested to Money that gender role was acculturated and imprinted, those are his terms, at multiple levels of a person's psychosexual orientation, and that those levels were not automatically coherent with one another. However, Money believed that psychoendocrinology could resolve this potential incoherence. Medical technology, he posited, could produce what nature could not guarantee, the unity of interior and exterior expressions of gender. This helps to explain why Money approached gender role, as he says in the above passage, as a variable of sex. That is, though Money disaggregated gender role from sex, he also posited a structural connection between them. As the term variable indicates, gender role signified for Money not only, quote, masculine or feminine inclination, outlook, or behavior, but also the prospective sex that he thought was supposed to coincide with a particular gender role. In this way, Money posited gender role as a predictive agent to determine a person with intersex's sex. In short, long before Butler, Money proposed that gender precedes sex. In contemporary feminist theory, the postulation of gender as prior to sex has been a touchstone for anti-foundationalist accounts of embodiment. For Butler, for instance, the reversal of the conceptual polarity of the sex-gender distinction represents the first subversive gesture in a two-pronged deconstructive movement of reversal and displacement. But it seems absolutely crucial to recognize that Money's superordination of gender over sex was not a subversive gesture, but rather a regulatory one. By determining an intersex infant's prospective gender role, Money was then retroactively able to determine the infant's sex as male or female. And this is why his treatment recommendations centered on surgical, hormonal, and psychosocial normalization. In using gender role to fill the unnamed blank intersexuality represented, Money attempted to make individuals born with intersex characteristics fit into normative schematizations of the roles conventionally embodied by people with dimorphic sex. At the very moment when his research pointed toward potentially radical instabilities between gender and sex and within gender and sex themselves, Money erased those possibilities by reducing gender to the performance of the roles he thought dimorphic sex should entail. I'm going to skip a little bit here for the sake of time. As Ian Moreland notes in his introduction to the 2009 special issue of GLQ, Intersex and After, the role of gender in the development of intersex treatment remains contentious. and it does so particularly in Money's research in particular. In the paragraph from his original 1955 article, Hermaphroditism, Gender, and Precocity, in hyperadrenocorticism, in which the term first appeared, Money theorized gender role as pertaining specifically to the way in which behavior cannot be causally linked to biological sex. He writes, chromosomal, gonadal, hormonal, and assigned sex, each of them interlinked, have all come under review as indices which may be used to predict an hermaphroditic person's gender, his or her outlook, demeanor, and orientation. Of the four, assigned sex stands up as the best indicator. Apparently, a person's gender role as boy or girl, man or woman, is built up cumulatively through the life experiences he encounters and the life experiences he transacts. Note that. Gender role may be likened, he says, to a native language. Once ingrained, a person's native language may fall into disuse and be supplanted by another, but it is never entirely eradicated. So also a gender role may be changed, or resembling native bilingualism may be ambiguous. But it may also become so deeply ingrained that not even flagrant contradictions of body functioning and morphology may displace it, end quote. Historically linked with the concepts of ethnicity and the mother tongue, a native language is the first language one learns. It is learned, but almost as soon as it is learned, it becomes habitual, reflexive, deeply rooted, ingrained, to use Money's term, almost as if it were natural. Money's analogy positions gender as a dynamic object, formed over time, related to but not fully determined by both biology and culture, changeable under certain conditions but not always intentionally so. Gender's shape, stability, and permanence have few guarantees, yet Money implies that Western biomedicine can comprehend this object through scientific study and thereby attempt to control it. This is sort of not only the pathologizing aspect of his argument, but his paternalistic aspect. Money's reference to native bilingualism as ambiguous is also noteworthy. The figure marks native bilingualism as indefinite, unclear, and confusing, when in fact, bilingualism just means that a person grows up speaking two languages. Crucially, bilingualism destabilizes those nations and cultural traditions that privilege the idioms of monolingualism and ethnocentrism. Money codes categories and bodily configurations that trouble expected boundaries and forms, disrupt cultural norms and preconceptions, and challenge ideas of sovereignty and wholeness as a threat to intelligibility. As with the unnamed blank analyzed above, Money's diagnostic effort becomes regulatory, an effort to contain that which generates ambiguities and proliferates languages and meanings. The regulatory aspect of Money's work is especially apparent in the gendered language that shapes the passage I've been reading. Between the first and the third sentence, and I'm not going to reread them to you now, but you can look here. It's the first and the third sentence. He switches, there's a grammatical shift from his or her to he. When he switches to the masculine singular pronoun, he uses it as the general form of personhood. And I would argue that this usage reveals the masculinism, or more precisely, the masculine universalism that guides Money's project. A masculine universalism evident not only at the level of grammar, but also in the conceptual transition from hermaphroditism to binary gender. In short, Money resolves the tension between the destabilization and multiplication of sexes and sex subject positions inaugurated by his research on intersex and binary grammar by privileging the masculine singular pronoun as the signifier of universal personhood. And as many have noted, this masculinism was in fact central to Money's deployment of gender role as a category of prediction and treatment. By the mid-20th century, the discipline of surgery had advanced to the point where doctors could perform surgical sex reassignments. It was indeed through initial medical experiments on intersex infants that the techniques for transsexual surgery were developed. And I think this is a chapter in history that has yet to be fully explored, and that more research really needs to be done on this. And the techniques that were used on intersex folks were originally developed during the context of World War I. And so you have remarkable intersections between the building of nation states, the machinery of war, and the history of science and medicine, and the pathologization of particular bodies, and yet also these emergent new configurations of embodiment that are happening here. And I'm working on a chapter on this in the book project I'm working on now, so I'd be happy to talk about that later if folks want to hear about it. So in this time, sex reassignment, quote unquote, could only be framed as medically necessary if it could be shown that an intersex infant's psychosocial orientation could be predicted. And what Money was seeking to do was to fill precisely that gap. That is, he used gender role to theorize sex as surgically malleable and gender as socially plastic. And he did all this, not to be radical or hip, but to maintain the binary order of things. So what he developed at Johns Hopkins, and I'll now start to conclude a little bit, start to wrap it up, is Money designed what is called the optimal gender paradigm. Along with other researchers at Johns Hopkins, this paradigm held that, quote, the sex of assignment and rearing is consistently and conspicuously more a reliable prognosticator of a hermaphrodite's gender role and orientation than is the chromosomal, gonadal, or hormonal sex, blah, 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 blah. You can read the rest of the quote. As Rosario explains, the Hopkins team was arguing that, quote, infants born with ambiguous genitalia, notice that term, could be surgically corrected and then successfully raised as either males or females. This is the dominant model of the medical management of intersex that we know today. It is changing, but it's still widely practiced in hospitals across North America, Europe, and in other parts of the globe. So these conditions that the Hopkins team thought had to be met in order for this, quote unquote, to work were that gender assignment was performed before 18 to 24 months, that parents strictly enforced the gender of rearing, and that children were not, quote, confused by knowledge about their intersex past. And we now, I hope, can see the ethical violations in each of these different points. I think intersex activists like ISNA and OII and many others have pointed these ethical violations out in tremendously effective ways. According to Alice Drager and April Herndon, the optimal gender paradigm, quote, held that all sexually ambiguous children should, indeed must, be made into unambiguous-looking boys or girls to ensure unambiguous gender identities. In other words, if gender is like language and gender instability, that is, changing genders, is like native bilingualism, Money's ultimate goal was to eradicate ambiguity in the name of promoting monolingualism. This seems to resolve the problem of both discursive excess, what he called too many words, and linguistic inadequacy, what he called an unnamed blank that craved a name. In recommending that intersex infants be treated with a combination of normalizing genital surgeries, hormone treatments, and psychosocial rearing into the optimal gender, Money and his colleagues essentially designed a program of sex and gender normalization. And this program of normalization, I think, can be understood as a refinement of the masculinism disguised as grammatical, inherent in Money's privileging of the masculine pronoun. As Carcassis points out, Money and other intersex specialists' intentions were, to some degree at least, beneficent. That is, they thought their protocols, their treatment protocols, would help intersex children to live normal lives. But as countless intersex activists and scholars have pointed out, their treatment paradigm was deeply problematic. First and foremost, because it inflicted tremendous physical and psychological trauma, and then secondly, because it upholds an unjust system of bodily and psychical regulation that ignores the values of informed consent and bodily integrity. And I would suggest, and this is the point I'll conclude on today, I won't get to all the reflections on the place of intersex and WGS, but we'll be taking up that later, so that's okay. That the ethical political critique of the medical management of intersex can be strengthened by supplementing it with the genealogical critique of gender, that is the history I presented here. Whereas the ethico-political critique, often associated with activism, but it's not exclusive to there, I think you find it in scholarship too and in just people's everyday practices as well, underscores medicine's failure to uphold the Hippocratic Oath, which is first do no harm, when it comes to the treatment of people with intersex. The genealogical critique I've provided here foregrounds the linkages between the medical management of intersex and the biopolitical regulation of embodied difference more broadly. At the level of activist strategizing, making these connections visible could expose the limitations of an exclusive focus on patient-centered healthcare, which tends to frame the patient primarily as a neoliberal consumer, and might enable the adoption of a more expansive vision of sexual and gender justice for a multicultural, transnational world. And here's the point at which I'll conclude. One activist group that has taken some steps in this direction productively is organization Intersex International, which has board members in 21 countries across the globe, and it's growing every day. OII recognizes that the medicalization of intersex is distinct from but related to the medicalization of transgender, the medicalization of disability, the stigmatization of queerness, and other forms of corporeal normalization. Responding to medical professionals and some activists' recent embrace of the term DSD, which stands for Disorders of Sex Development, in place of intersex, members of OII have created posters and broadsides that contest the DSD nomenclature. One declares, "Sorry, we're not disordered," while another contains a warning sign in skull and crossbones placed next to text that reads, DSD, death to sex differences. DSD equals eugenics. DSD equals heterosexism. DSD equals transphobia. DSD equals homophobia. OII's intersection, I applaud them too. And I think these posters and broadsides are really important for the critique they mobilize. Their intersectional critique, notice I'm saying this is an intersectional critique, of the DSD nomenclature frames the medicalization of intersex as fundamentally linked with multiple overlapping systems of power knowledge. And they adopt a human rights approach to intersex in order to counter medicalization by promoting the values of anatomical diversity, bodily integrity, and informed consent. So if the ethico-political critique stresses the human rights of intersex individuals, the genealogical critique I presented today, I would say, adds a historical dimension to this analysis. It shows how deeply invested and deeply troubled the medical model has been in its quest to contain anatomical variation and the threat such a variation poses to the epistemic and somatic certainty of dimorphism. And the reason why, to conclude then, and skip a little bit, the reason why the study of intersex is important for everyone, but especially WGSS, is because this deeply problematic history of ethical violations and the creation of trauma for so many folks is what gave birth to the concept and practice of gender as we know it today. And that means that the medicalization of intersex in a certain way touches everyone's life, even if one's life seems very distant from it. And so I think by making these connections ever more palpable and evident, it becomes possible to see why the intersex movement is a movement that is relevant to everyone and that everybody may have something deeply important to learn from. Thanks a bunch, folks.
The concept of gender is artificial and that it doesn't have a referent.
No, I'm not saying it's artificial. No, but I am saying it's a product of a history of struggle, and that recognizing that history helps to reveal gender's contingency and also its power. So I'm not saying one sense, I'm not even talking about people's individual senses of gender, but I'm not saying anybody's sense of gender is artificial.
Well, are you saying that do you believe there is such a thing as gender?
Yeah.
Because there are some people who, and these two kinds of people sometimes seem to be in the same camp. Some say gender is just an artificial construct. It does not have a referent in the real world. Other people reify it and say it's not an abstract concept. It is something physical right there in your brain.
I think I'm trying to understand how both the body, however we want to refer to it, and biological processes of humans and culture interact to create this concept.
Well, right, but if the concept is not free-floating.
Yes.
It refers to something in the real world.
This is a challenging question, and a good one. I think what I'm interested in asking is how does gender come to refer to something real? I guess I want to ask about what are the stakes for you or for other folks in posing that. Why does that answer matter, I think, is a more important question to ask.
Okay. The reason why I ask is there are some ideas about intersex treatment that say that gender is this inborn thing that tells you from the day you're born that you're a boy or a girl. And I call that reifying gender. There are other people who say it's that money was wrong in even creating the concept because it's meaningless. And as I said, sometimes people with these two completely divergent ideas seem to be in the same camp. But I personally, I think that the concept that John Money created, I've called it John Money's monster. It's like a Frankenstein monster was created in his laboratory, and then it escaped and went on a rampage.
What a metaphor.
Take a couple.
I'm sorry I went over, Angie. I wasn't looking at my clock right. If we need to move to the next thing, that's fine. Okay.
Hi, I heard you say people with intersex a couple of times, and I don't know anything, so educate me, anyone, all of you. Why do you use those words in
People first language.
in that order? Okay, and then does that also kind of play into an idea that like intersex might be some kind of diagnosis or thing that's not necessarily inherent, like we've been talking about, it's neither biological nor...
Well, this is a great question, and one I'm happy to have the occasion to think about with you. What counts as intersex in any particular society is always determined in relation to what gets to count as male or female. So this is a challenging point to teach, but in my classes I point out, using a semi-funny but not, I don't know, just weird example, only certain kinds of things get to count as intersex. This is really important. So I'm going to use a phrase, I'm not trying to offend anybody, but little babies with giant penises don't get called intersex. And that's just a weird phrase to roll off the tongue because we don't think of babies as like, oh wow, this kid's got a giant penis. But we don't medicalize them. But little girls, for lack of a better term there maybe, who do have large clitorises are totally medicalized and surgically normalized in a variety of ways that have been shown to be deeply traumatic and loss of sensation and all these other problems. So what counts as intersex is contingent on what counts as male or female in a given society, and these are sort of asymmetrical concepts, if I can put it that way. So one becomes pathologized, another becomes normalized, and I think that language, people with intersex, is trying to highlight not only that people are born with various bodies, which they absolutely are, but also that there's a particular history there, if I can put it that way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. I found that really very brilliant and stimulating. And I just have one quick question, which is, what if John Money had never existed?
What a question. Thought experiment, eh?
Someone write down the answer for me.
I once heard, do you have the answer back there, Angie? I once heard a really, really famous, well, to my mind, and a hero of mine, a feminist science studies scholar, say that we would be better off if the sex-gender distinction had never been invented. And that was, for me, a shocking claim, and I'm still reckoning with it. So I think, your question's a great one. How much would be different? How much would be the same? Would somebody else have come up with something that looked like his concept of gender? I can't say. Certainly other societies have not had the word gender, but have had sets of social relations where something that looks a lot like gender seems to be operative. So for instance, in the 19th century in Italy, it was recognized that there were people who had a physical body that was classified as either male or female, but had a mental or psychological state that didn't coincide with that. And they certainly understood there was some sort of distinction, but they didn't call it gender. And so what do we call it now is a difficult question, and I think historians are still trying to figure this out, and it's not settled.
Hi. I'm really interested in the concept of social construct gender. When I came of age as a lesbian feminist and took women's studies courses, that was a really radical concept. And I'm listening to, and I'm learning beyond that today. I'm learning all kinds of things myself today. However, in the larger context of the world and how it still works in a binary way, in terms of male dominance, patriarchy, oppression, all of that, that social construct argument can be incredibly effective to move beyond those that's sort of pre-assigned ideas of male and female. I'd hate to lose that in the larger world. We still have so far to go just to get patriarchy to understand how oppressive that is. And at the same time, obviously, I, as an ally, do not want to be oppressive to people in the intersex community. So can you address that conflict a little bit?
Can you address that in a minute? Because I think that's totally relevant to how we teach intersex in women's studies. Is it okay to hold that for the panel? Oh. Yep. Do you have a shorthand answer?
I'm writing a note here. So you do want an answer or you don't? I'm sorry.
Yeah. Do you have a short answer for now? Save us the long answer.
I'm not sure that we should seek to resolve that tension. I think that tension might be useful, is my short answer. Was that short enough?
Yes, thank you very much. Hold on one second. If you think that your question might be teaching related, please hold it.
Hi, this is not teaching related. Like, I really enjoyed the talk, but the two words which jumped out at me in the introduction and the conclusion, rather a phrase like the transnational multicultural world we inhabit. But the genealogy which we have traced today is a very specific genealogy in terms of how we talk about sex and gender. So I'm wondering what really is the, how does that, so that in the introduction and the conclusion, does it open out the discussion, or
Yes.
does
so
it impose some sort of a
both the
closure?
Sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. In the larger paper, but then in the larger book project, I take up that question to a greater extent. Gender no longer belongs to money, and it's been appropriated by many, among them second-wave feminists, and not only US feminists, but feminists around the globe. And in different places, there have been different rates of sort of the appropriation and then subsequent use of gender. So gender is now being globalized as a way to understand relations between men and women and other sorts of gendered subjects for folks who don't identify with that in different places around the globe. But for instance, in France, it was only a couple years ago that, you have to forgive my French pronunciation, les genre, how do you say it? Anybody? There you go. That was introduced as a way of referring to human beings. Before that, it was only literally genre, as in just a genre. Whereas, say, in Colombia, because of the unique history of intersex in medicine and in activism there's a longer history of using the word gender in the Spanish language in that part of Latin America. And not only in the context of intersex activism and biomedicine, but also among feminists in that part of Latin America. So this varies tremendously around the world. Nonetheless, I'd still say that gender now is a globalizing concept. When it's internalized and then used by organizations like the UN and the WTO and the World Bank, we know that something really profound has happened in terms of a concept starting out in what was a relatively unknown corner of biomedicine in the West, and now being transported and changed in the process, because it doesn't mean the same thing for the UN that it meant for money, but it's still being used. And so I'm surprised and want to continue investigating how it can take on these multiple meanings. I don't mean to suggest that every different culture and country around the globe has all followed this treatment model, because some cultures have not treated people with intersex in the ways John Money sought to at all. But many have. In Australia, for instance, and South Africa, there are significant histories of the medicalization of intersex that are just starting to be written now. And my work is part of that conversation, but can't hope to cover the whole globe at the same time. So that would be how I would respond there.
Thank you. I really appreciate everything you've said. Could you repeat your wording at the very end about the medicalization of intersex, how the way it's impacted all bodies? I just really appreciated the word choice you had.
Oh, okay, yeah, so my idea here, I mean, the argument, this is really the argument of the book project I'm trying to write now, is that the difference between the surgical and hormonal normalization of people with intersex, and then the gender normalization practices that happen all the time, say to little babies, pink and blue, is not a difference of kind, but is a difference of degree and is part of the same regime. Does that make sense? I think that's a better way to say it. So, yeah, the difference between surgically normalizing intersex bodies and socially normalizing, say, children's gender identities. The other day, my dentist was telling me this crazy story of how she's trying to get her little 3-year-old nephew to become a man. So whenever he cries, she says to him in a very loud voice, "Man up!" And I didn't feel it was my place to comment on or to offer any guidance on parenting techniques. But I find this sort of example to be of the same, part of the same regime of normalization that surgery and surgical normalization. Does that make sense? Sorry, I was having trouble putting that sentence together.
Thanks. Okay, we're going to take this one last question and then move on to our panel.
Yeah, in your working definition of intersex, I heard you use the term medical intervention in that definition, and I'm curious why, or if you've considered expanding your genealogy to predate the proliferation of science, or looking at other systems of regulation that involve gender and sex before modern scientific systems.
That's absolutely essential, and you're right. My focus is on this specific period of history, but other folks have done some of that work. So for instance, Sharon Prevs has a chapter sort of looking at cross-cultural understandings and different sex/gender systems at different moments in history and around the globe. And that is a really important thing to look at, to once again reveal how fast things change, actually, and how contingent these relations are between institutions, subjects, and power and knowledge.
Thank you.
Thanks for the great questions, y'all. I really appreciate it.